Now I'm joined by Aloys Bruggeman, a Dutch economist, and who is also the honorary consul of the Republic of Lithuania in the Netherlands for the region of Limburg. And he's joining me now to discuss this further in terms of the economic impacts of what's happening in Ukraine and the wider region. Hello, sir. Welcome to TVP World.
Hello, welcome. Nice to have me.
Thank you so much. So if I'm looking at the recent World Bank data here, Ukraine could lose almost half of its economy. We're looking at a 45% loss of GDP. So could it get any worse?
Yeah, the question if it will get any worse for Ukraine itself will, of course, depend on how long and how severe the war itself will be. But that it's really getting a big problem. The workforce is not there, the transport is not there, and so I think probably things will get worse for the coming year.
Right, indeed. So you mentioned now, I'm looking and we're all seeing and covering these terrible pictures and events. The devastation is absolutely mind-boggling. Infrastructure, economics, everything, ports, it's an absolute nightmare. Where do you start? I mean, we're talking about a kind of recovery and reconstruction, but when could this conceivably even begin, given the conflict is still raging?
Yeah. So what I see in the last few days is that Ukraine is trying to reconnect via other means of transportation, for example, railroad connections. But this is only a very small part can be transported on this way. If the ships are not coming to the harbors, the problem will be very substantial. And then we have the problem of growing new wheat when there is constantly bombarding, there is no workforce. And one thing what is not mentioned is also the lack of fertilizers.
Right.
Russia is one of the biggest fertilizer producer in the world. And so this is also, if you don't have fertilizer, you cannot grow wheat in large quantities.
Indeed. It has that impact on food and energy prices just as well, doesn't it? But I want to bring up a chart right now for our viewers here to see. So this is a growth forecast for countries, not just in Ukraine, but in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And if I'm looking at that, I don't know if our viewers can see that right now, but looking at Ukraine dropping 45%, as I said, but also looking at other countries in the Central Asian region. I'm looking at Kyrgyzstan, predicted to lose about 5%, Tajikistan 1.8%, also into Turkey, negative numbers here. So how do you assess this greater impact? Is this a contagion now? Will we see a recession just grow out of this whole thing?
Yeah, for sure. I think, as also the Secretary General of the United Nations mentioned, we have a perfect storm for a recession or even worse. We had this quantitative easing for quite some time. We had the pandemic and still having its effect like in China, where we still have a lockdown. And then we have the wheat problem and the oil and gas problem. So almost everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong. So I think that a crisis is very, very likely, almost certain for the coming year.
I was going to mention we have our hands full in terms of crises and all kind. How do you assess currently? You just mentioned very briefly. Let's look at a little bit of the impact of the current lockdown in China. That's a huge thing right now with factories closed. How do you see this impacting in terms of the supply chain with this greater region, Central Europe, and everything else?
I think it has a major impact. You see that all these production lines and all the processes were very streamlined and were very dependent on products from China. So if some products are lacking, even for example the computer chips, car factories have to be shut down for one day or longer periods of time. And so we see this in the whole production chain. If one element falls out, then we really have a big impact. So this is only the pandemic. So this on its own is already causing enormous problems. And if the supply is not there, prices will go up.
Indeed. Do you see any, if we're comparing now Central European economies going further east into Central Asia, do you see any economies that, let's say, are more resilient to the current shocks at the moment, or is this going to just impact everyone?
I think that the countries that have commodities or oil, and I think that they are, of course, not as vulnerable, but especially countries that have a lot dependent on imports, they really will have a very problematic time. And you also have to bear in mind that a lot of these countries already have quite a poor population and problems with food. Already 1 in 9 out of people in the world is already at this moment, before the war, had not enough food every day. So this will increase dramatically.
Are there countries that could step in? As you said, this may well turn into famine for many countries. Many are dependent on, as we said, the wheat imports from Ukraine, especially in North Africa and the Middle East. Is there an option for other countries to step in and fill in that gap, what's missing? Do you see more agricultural products being stepped up and shipped maybe in Europe or elsewhere in the world?
For wheat, I think this will be quite problematic because the infrastructure is not there. Maybe if people would change their diet a bit, because like large in Europe and Northern Africa, we're more dependent on wheat. A lot of Asian countries are more rice-based, rice flour, and so they have